Without further ado, we're pleased to have Mr. Warrick Cleine, Chairman and CEO and Heads of Deals, Tax and Legal for KPMG in Vietnam, to deliver the opening remarks and the first sessions on macroeconomics and tax landscape. Please welcome Mr. Warrick Cleine.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tom. I'm very, very pleased to be able to talk to you all this morning. I know that we have record attendance at this year's Tax and Legal Institute. I think that is credit to the amazing work that our whole team have put into bringing this program together for you all, and also really to the support that you give to KPMG in all times, good times and bad times. So on behalf of the firm and our partners and professionals here at KPMG, thank you everybody for your support of us and for participating in today's events. We're going to be showing, I think, the very best of the firm over the course of the day, going through all sorts of issues that are incredibly important for anybody doing business here in Vietnam this year. Talking about some of the experiences that we have, the challenges that you all have, how we are working with you to deal with them, how we're helping clients resolve what is, in many respects, one of the most unusual years, one of the most unusual periods that any of us have been in business for. I think there is going to be opportunity, of course, for you to be asking questions during the day. I think there'll be some interaction, although, of course, this format is different to normal, and it won't be the usual way that we work together. But I think it's going to be a really engaging day and a really interesting day as well. So I wanted to really start by putting some of the lessons that we're going to learn today and the information that we're going to have in some sort of context, because one of the most important things about both business and tax is that it doesn't operate, we don't operate in a vacuum. We operate very much in a wider world where all sorts of things are happening that impact us, that impact our businesses, and that impact the government. And often this comes together in the tax arena. It's one of the most fascinating areas of professional services, and one of the reasons that I think everybody that's going to be talking to you today from our tax practice is engaged in this particular part of the profession. It's interesting, it's fascinating, and it's changing. I almost don't know where to start when looking at the slide in front of you now, because I've just pulled out a number of events and factors that have been at play just over the last year in relation to Vietnam. And I think we would all agree that 2020 is so far a year that we'll never forget for the sheer volume of unpredictable, unusual, and highly impactful events that have come upon us. And we've all, as business leaders or as finance professionals or as tax professionals, had to navigate our way through this and respond to the circumstances that we're presented with. While a lot of the things on the slide here on the page appear to be unconnected, I want to try to come together at the end in a lesson or a common theme. But it's challenging because for all of the years I've been in business, I'm not sure that we've had such variety of different events, geopolitical, economic, health, social, tax, regulatory, and so on, coming together in one year. So let me just make a few comments on some of these areas. And COVID, I'll come to in a little bit more detail in a minute. Picking first a topic that now almost feels like it's ancient history, which was the US-China trade dispute, which of course was activated by the Trump administration in the US. It was primarily due to perception or reality in the United States that US manufacturing jobs were being lost, that the economic imbalances were unfair, and that the trade environment needed to be changed. This has been viewed in Vietnam over a number of years now as a positive for Vietnam, partly because it's a negative for China, or viewed as a negative for China, rightly or wrongly. We have seen manufacturers shift sourcing to Vietnam, and we've seen countries around the Asian region really worked to build relationships with Vietnam to balance up, in some ways to make up for the impact of the US-China trade dispute. I think it's a little bit wrong to think that in the long run this was going to be beneficial for China, because the principal policy objective of the Trump administration was, as we know, America first. And over time, they were starting to view anything that didn't benefit the United States as being equally damaging to their interests. And we saw just in the last few months the beginnings of the process that could have seen US sanctions even imposed on exports sourced from Vietnam, starting with investigations into the manipulation or management of Vietnam's currency. So US-China trade dispute is something which has been positive in the short term for Vietnam as companies have moved here, but was in danger of evolving into a challenging situation for Vietnam in the same way that it has for other countries that have been subject to US trade sanctions as well. That has led us into the US election in the last few weeks. And as you know, the current state of play is that President-elect Biden has been confirmed as the winner of the election by analysts and is in the process of forming a new administration. And we all now need to get our heads around what this incoming administration means for the trade environment globally and also for Vietnam as well. It's very, very early days, and I don't think it's possible to really predict. But if we look back to some of the statements that have been made during the campaign by the Democrats and by Biden, and also the practices of the previous Democratic administration, both the Obama administration and the Clinton administration, we saw, compared to the Trump administration, a real commitment to multilateralism, to organisations like the WTO and now the WHO being very, very relevant. We saw efforts to conclude the CPTPP under the previous administration. And we saw a general idea that the United States was keen to ensure that economic development in Asia was balanced, that it wasn't concentrated in any one place, and that other countries in Asia were strengthened. And Vietnam was a considerable beneficiary of that process through Clinton, Obama, and previous US administrations actually. So we might see, and we should see, a return to that theme under the Biden administration, which, as Vietnam is a relatively small participant in global trade, but global trade is really important to Vietnam. That direction of multilateralism, enforcement of the WTO, reinforcement of the rules-based trading system is something that will be really beneficial to Vietnam in the medium to long term. So I think this ought to be viewed in a positive sense. On the other side of the world, in Europe and in the UK, we saw pretty major developments over the last few years with Brexit, and we saw the European Union enter into a free trade agreement with Vietnam just over the last few months, the culmination of a very long process for both sides. I think here what we're seeing is a continuation of Vietnam's commitment to participate in trade agreements and a real willingness of Europe to engage with Vietnam and to recognise the importance of Vietnam in the global trading system as well. So this is also a real positive for Vietnam, not only because of the very clear and obvious economic benefits of having a free trade agreement with Europe, but also because it places Vietnam at the front of the line in ASEAN when European markets are looking for trading partners, and Vietnam is one of the few countries in Southeast Asia to have this free trade agreement with the EU. Brexit as well is important, and we saw in September a visit to Vietnam by the UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, which was largely in furtherance of the UK's efforts to conclude a trade agreement with Vietnam as well. And the Foreign Secretary was very clear in his visit, and I had the good fortune to spend some time with him, that those talks are really positive, that Vietnam is well engaged, that the UK is well engaged, and that trade agreement's a real high priority for the United Kingdom, and clearly also for Vietnam. And on a related theme, we saw more recently, following the unfortunate retirement of Prime Minister Abe in Japan for health reasons, the first overseas visit of the new Japanese Prime Minister was to Vietnam as well. I bracket those two because there are actually very few face-to-face visits or diplomatic missions happening anywhere in the world right now. So for the UK Foreign Secretary, Mr. Raab, and for the Japanese Prime Minister to prioritise Vietnam on their visit schedule is, I think, something that all of us doing business here ought to be not only proud of, but also taking a pretty strong signal that these really important countries regard Vietnam as really important. And I know that has emboldened the efforts within Vietnam to continue entering into trade agreements, to opening up, to reforming and so on. So, as I said, I'll come to COVID, but if we look at this picture as a whole, we can see both positive and challenging messages here. I think overall we ought to say that the experience in 2020 is an experience which demonstrates resilience, and Vietnam's resilience and ability to travel through a really challenging time, and also to continue to lay foundations for a really positive future as well. So that's been 2020. COVID, because I need to talk about this topic because it's simply unavoidable, and it's something which has impacted all of us so much. Early on in the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of debate around the world by many governments as to whether they had to trade off health to economics. And the feeling was that if you prioritised the health of your citizens by shutdowns, by closing borders and so on, that the economic pain would be more severe. And this is a debate that is strangely still going on in some parts of the world, particularly the United States. It's been a major debate in their election. The numbers really show clearly that the trade-off is not a trade-off at all. That in fact, by taking measures to protect the health of your citizens, you also protect the economy. And we can see the numbers flowing through already in GDP results for 2020 versus the health impacts of COVID, that those countries that have contained the COVID outbreak domestically have suffered the least economic damage. Those that have allowed COVID to run wild, that have had a significant health impact, have suffered much more economic damage in 2020. And as we all know, those of us living in Vietnam, the government moved so fast to close the borders, to track and isolate and quarantine people with COVID, that the health impacts on the Vietnamese population were very, very limited. That the lockdown period that we had, or the semi-lockdown period that we had back in April, was relatively limited, and that the domestic economy, notwithstanding certain segments of it being shut down, has continued to perform pretty strongly as well. And we can see across Asia countries that have a similar record, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Korea, Japan, North Asian countries, Vietnam, are performing considerably stronger economically than those that have not controlled the health outbreak. This has a couple of really interesting impacts for us that we have to think about, and it flows through to tax policy. And I think the two big lessons that we can learn from this is that the business world, and particularly the international business community, have demonstrated and continue to talk about their great respect for the way the Vietnamese government has handled the crisis. I think that the response here has increased the goodwill from investors about Vietnam and its economic prospects, and that investors can feel confident that the Vietnamese government is one that can not only develop policy which is sound, but implement policy which is sound as well. So we have, in other words, created an environment of greater business confidence. And we've also created an environment of economic growth, which much of the world would love to have. The latest forecasts for this year show that really only Vietnam and China in Asia are going to come through 2020 without suffering a reduction in GDP from 2019. Every other Asian market is suffering a significant contraction in its GDP. And in the developed world, Europe and other countries, it's even worse. Significant reductions in GDP in 2020. So Vietnam to record an economic growth result is also really important because it shows that this continues to be a place where businesses can invest and can enjoy success. So I think there's a couple of really positive lessons coming out of the COVID situation, not least of which we can all still go to restaurants and bars and beaches, and we can enjoy normal and healthy lives here. So how does this flow through to tax? Well, the challenging thing is that although the country is still growing and recording GDP growth, it is growing at a slower rate than was predicted. And when GDP drops, a number of things happen, one of which overall economic activity drops, and that has an impact on things like the VAT collections, and corporate profits drop, and personal incomes drop. And these things result in reductions in personal income tax and in corporate income tax as well. So significant drop in expected tax revenue. Unfortunately, on the other side of the equation, the way governments spend money make it much harder to quickly respond to that by cutting expenditure. And in fact, quite deliberately, because of the economic impact, the government has kept spending in order to ensure that capital expenditure projects and what have you are not interrupted and that the economic impact is lessened. The net result of those things, lower taxes than you thought, higher spending than you thought, is a greater budget deficit than you thought. And Vietnam is likely in 2020 to record its all-time high in relation to budget deficits, 6% of GDP, which has to be financed through borrowings and asset sales. So a significant impact on the tax environment. What that means, if you are the Minister of Finance, we're going to be hearing later from Mr. Fung from the tax authorities, is that you have to respond, and you have to work out how you can respond to that environment in a way that doesn't, from an economic perspective, damage the economy further, or from a business confidence perspective, damage the desire of businesses to continue to invest in the country. So you see, and we'll be talking about these things all through the day today, the tax authorities working in a couple of ways to correct this position, both in respect to 2020, but also through 2021. And there are two broad areas that they are taking action. One is around strengthening the tax base through tax reform, and they're doing that through some of the tax policies that they are promulgating, and I'll leave it to my colleagues to go into detail some of the changes in tax law that are occurring, but often are designed to limit the deductions you can have, to reduce tax incentives, to protect the tax base through enhanced transfer pricing, or to broaden the tax base through things like taxation of e-commerce or areas that in the economy that may not have previously been taxed. So tax reform is a big part of the response to this, and you'll see them talking about it. And the other area is tax enforcement. And my colleagues will talk about the current environment in relation to tax audits and tax disputes. This is something that we are certainly seeing impact a lot of compliance in 2020, and we expect to be a really big issue in 2021, where the tax authorities are instructed by the government to increase the number of audits and to significantly increase the revenue that they collect as a result of audit activity here as well. And you can see some of the statistics on the chart here. 49,000 tax audits, over 400,000 tax filing reviews where they look at the tax returns you put in, and an almost 40% increase in revenue from tax audit activity as well. So that's what they do if they are suffering, what any government in the world does when it's suffering shortages in their tax revenues and their tax outlook. So I know we're going to get into all of these areas in a lot more detail today. Almost every one of the red boxes at the bottom of the page here is a topic of great discussion, and will continue to be a topic of enormous interest, I think, to all of you guys. I'll close off, but I'll close simply by wishing you all well. I think we had fantastic news this week, not only in the US elections, but also in the progress of the scientific community making towards a vaccine for COVID. So some of us are daring to imagine a world where things are normal again. So let's feel optimistic about 2020 and 2021, and be grateful for where we're working and where we're doing business, and excited about the opportunities that lie ahead. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Warrick. Thank you very much, Warrick, for the wonderful opening.